Pope Francis is fond of speaking of the need of the church to go out to the peripheries. To go out. Another way of describing the church's missionary dimension. The Good Shepherd does not settle for 99 out of 100, but seeks out the one sheep that is lost in the wilderness. As disciples, we can't simply sit here and wait for others to find us, but must go out to seek those who most need to hear the good news. Some of this is done through the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, of which Jesus speaks frequently in the gospel. But today's gospel and readings in particular are not about this. The theme today is more about the church ad intra, not ad extra. It's about the care of those in the household of God, which is also important. Even as Jesus travels with his disciples to the towns to preach, at times he calls the disciples together off to the side to rest and to enjoy the company of one another. In an erroneous, once saved, always saved brand of Christianity, which we find amongst some of our Protestant brethren, not all, preaching and conversion are all that are needed to win more disciples. But what about supporting the life of discipleship? How do we support people during the ups and downs of Christian life? This reminds us of the importance of the ecclesial dimension, the aspect of the church. It's not just you and Jesus, me and Jesus. It is we and Jesus. When we encounter one another and care for one another, we indeed encounter Jesus. Whoever receives you receives me, he tells us today. Simply put, we need each other. And so today I'd like to offer a non-exhaustive list of 5 ways that we can do a better job of caring for one another in the household of God. Number 1, show up. They say that 90% of life is showing up. Just the beginning, though, for Christian discipleship. It's the minimum bar. You would not skip your anniversary date with your spouse or your child's birthday. They certainly would not accept the reason that you were tired, that you had a headache, that you had other plans, you had family in town, you were on vacation, or just forgot and never got around to it. And yet, that is what we do when we fail to observe the Lord's Day. But even further, if you missed the family Christmas or Thanksgiving gathering, your family members would be saddened. The picture, the gathering, would be incomplete. Our sins are not victimless. In fact, when each of us fails to do as the Lord asks, we harm one another. When one of us is not here, it hurts the family of God. We gather together on Sunday to worship God, but he also brings us together to support one another, to bring the family of God together. Tomorrow, the church celebrates the feast of St. Thomas. And of course, poor St. Thomas gets the poor rap of forever being defined by his infamous moment and forever being known as Doubting Thomas. And that's the exact gospel we hear on his feast day, the same gospel we hear on the second Sunday of Easter. Jesus appearing to his disciples in the upper room gathered, revealing himself in his glorified body, and then afterwards the rest of them tell Thomas, since he wasn't there about it, he says, I won't believe unless I see the marks of the nails, put my hand in his side, I won't believe. And so Jesus graciously does it a second time the following week when Thomas is gathered with them. We know that story well. It's the origin of the Doubting Thomas story. But we skip over kind of the most fundamental detail that sets up the whole story. Why wasn't Thomas there? The rest of the community, the whole apostolic band, the Mother of God, they were all gathered together in prayer, but where was Thomas? Is it any surprise that Thomas doubted? He didn't experience the overwhelming presence of Christ revealed to the church gathered at prayer. Thomas wasn't there. And so Thomas struggled until he saw it with his own eyes. But then, as Jesus said, "Blessed are you who have not seen and have believed." The Lord reveals himself most powerfully in the midst of the church, gathered in prayer. And so it is here that we must be. We have to show up. No excuses. The family of God needs you. Number 2 is to support vocations. When we hear this phrase, we often think about praying for vocations or looking for future priests. And that is important and part of the missionary dimension of the church, but that's not what I'm referring to right now. Yes, it's important to discern, to figure out vocations, but we also need to support one another in our determined vocations. Priests and religious have developed mechanisms for support in their vocations. I, as a priest, am a member of a group of priests that get together constantly, that we share our ups and downs in ministry, give each other words of encouragement, advice. It's a way of supporting one another in our priestly ministry. But what about married people? What about parents? Where does the support come about? Yes, people have hopefully friends and family in their lives, but what about the intentional support? How do we support one another in our vocation? Often I try to take a pause at the end of weddings to thank all of the guests gathered, of course, for being there, but to remind them that showing up for the wedding was the least important task that they had on the list. People who get invited to weddings tend to be invited because they're important in some way or another to the bride and groom, and as great as it is for them to be there for the celebration and to show up in all the wedding photos afterwards, the most important thing they can do is support the newly married couple after the wedding day, especially those who themselves are married. Okay, new couple, how do we support you in your struggles and your joys? When hardship hits, how do we support you? How do more experienced couples support younger ones, preparing for marriage, living out the early days? How do parents support one another when things inevitably get difficult? We need to support one another in our vocations. God adding his emphasis. Support one another in our vocations. Number 3, honesty in our struggles and flaws. Throughout all of human history, people have put on masks to project strength. It's not new to our current time, but social media in this age has taken it to extremes. When you go on social media, you see all the wonderful things happening in everyone's life. You see their vacation photos, you see all these wonderful things, you see wonderful portraits where everyone lined up, the kids are all lined up in matching outfits, everyone's smiling, there's a sunrise in the background. Oh, look at this wonderful food we ate. Oh, look at this picture of this awesome meal I just prepared. By the way, I didn't take a picture of the previous meal that I burned to a crisp. If you look online, everyone's lives are tidy and perfect all the time. And so for someone struggling, they see that and, wow, what a loser I am. Now we know this in the sense of individuals, especially the danger of social media with teenagers, younger people, especially young girls. The sense of individualization, sometimes even suicidal ideation that comes from the sense of feeling the need to measure up to an artificial norm. But this isn't just for the young, it's for families. Again, families, couples, moms, whatever it may be. Not every meal is perfect. Not every day has a beautiful sunset. There's the other days that are hectic. There's the other days that make no sense, the ones we don't want people to see. For every beautiful Martha Stewart home, there's a closet stuffed full of junk. Don't be afraid to be real with others. Someone else needs to see that it's okay to not have their stuff together all the time. Be real. Number 4, let people change. Sometimes we treat people as static characters as opposed to the dynamic creatures that human beings are. People change. Imagine if everyone treated you the same way as you were when you were a teenager. Imagine if every flaw you have conquered, no one noticed. If you were held to the same standard you were 30 years ago. That would be horrible, and yet so often we can typecast someone and refuse to ever allow them to grow or change. On Thursday, the church celebrated the solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul, and we look at those two bedrock apostles, the apostolic foundations of the church. But somewhere in there we need to remember that for the great martyrs, the great witnesses, the champions of Christ, well, Peter was a coward and a loudmouth, and Paul's first introduction was murdering Stephen. And yet, both of them, through the grace of God, become powerful champions of him. Imagine if Paul showed up on the missionary journey as like, wow, that's really impressive, Paul, but yeah, we heard about Stephen. Well, that was 30 years ago. Yeah, you're not welcome here. We need to let people grow as the same way that we hope others allow us to grow. This is the place where mercy needs to enter the picture. Just as we trust that God's grace is sufficient for us, it is sufficient for our neighbor. Give everyone a chance. And number 5 is take up your cross. We heard that straight out of the gospel passage today. But often when we hear the expression, we can minimalize it or equivocate it with that lazy old expression of just offer it up. Oh, I stubbed my toe, just offer it up. Whew, carried my cross today. Somehow I don't think that's exactly what Jesus had in mind. That's certainly not what he had in mind for himself. Today's admonition for the disciples to take up their cross is the first time Jesus ever uses the expression in the Gospel of Matthew. Unlike us, who we hear all the loaded meaning in the word take up your cross, as he says this to his disciples, they know nothing of his passion. They know nothing of what's going to happen on Calvary. For them, take up the cross simply means like if someone said, take up your electric chair. You want us to be humiliated and tortured? Why would he say that? The cross is different for each one of us. But one form of it for all of us in today's society is the challenge to be unapologetically Christian. In a different age, when society was mostly Christianized, or even those who weren't religious at least respected the foundation, those days are long gone. Today, to be unwaveringly Christian is to stick one's neck out. To stand firm on Christian principles is to sometimes invite scorn, rejection, or even hateful consequences. And yet, we're called to stand our ground. The gospel is always hated by the spirit of the age. It's a check on self and a call to sacrifice, not a popular message by the worldly spirit. But each of us, if we are truly disciples, are called to stand on that rock. Today, someone in your family, perhaps someone in your workplace, might need to see that they are not alone, that it's okay to be Christian. We need to not cower and hide, but show one another it's okay to stand firm to our principles. That doesn't mean engaging in battle, trying to smite all the heretics. That accomplishes nothing. But to be an unwavering witness, to stand firm in the love of Christ. Someone else in your life right now needs to see that from you. It's okay to carry the cross. And so in conclusion, those were 5 points, as I said, not an exhaustive list by any means. But we need to show up, support one another in our vocations, be honest in our struggles and flaws, let people change, and be willing to take up our cross. In the early church, the church father and writer Tertullian commented that the most powerful witness to bring people to the church was when the pagans observed the Christian community and said, "See how they love one another." It was startlingly different than the expectation and behavior of the rest of society. That has not changed. Our most powerful witness in our external missionary work continues to be how we love and treat our own. And so today I simply want to encourage you in your discipleship not to overthink it. Love God. Love God in your neighbor. Love God in the stranger. Whether outside or inside of these walls, live a life authentic to who you are and who you are called to be. And whoever gives only a cup of cold water to one of these little ones to drink, because the little one is a disciple, amen, I say to you, he will surely not lose his reward.